各位观众朋友们，大家好，欢迎收看 J 与 J 论坛，由我 Jimmy 马健与我们的好朋友 Jim Noe 一起跟我们聊聊这个礼拜的时事。Jim, how are you?
Hi, Jimmy.
I apologize. Every time I see Jim, I started chatting with him about this week, and usually it's just so good that it's just so insightful, and I forget to hit record. Sometimes maybe I should just sight record, just so that people can see what we talk about.
I think you probably should. You can edit it later because we wind up having two shows within one show.
Exactly. What we just talked about was it's very disheartening. So I'll start off by this. What we were talking about, I want our audience to kind of have an insight of what we were going to talk about and what ended up being the conversation. So me and Jim have both seen the video, which I don't know if I can bid it here. I probably shouldn't. A very violent Chicago couple that was at the Puerto Rican parade, drag out their car, executed on the streets by a mob of people they don't know. They were not robbing them. It was captured by city cameras. This could happen to me and my wife, or you and your wife. It could happen to anyone. What's happening in New York City last night? A gentleman and his friend robbed in Manhattan, dragged out and executed. We already see the crime rates in Miami, Chicago, New York, Portland, Seattle, Houston, Austin. And this is on top of the mass shootings. Crime is on everyone's mind. It's a disgrace. It is disheartening because me and Jim were talking earlier. I said, hey, as the weeks go by, we're glad to be American. We're glad to be here because we have vaccines. Economy's opening up. Is slowly but surely going back to normal. Mm-hmm. And we're enjoying the freedoms that's given to us because we are here in this country. Mm-hmm. And then you see what's going on, and it's such a big divide on the have and have-nots. Jim, mm-hmm. If we continue what we talked about earlier, it's too much extremism, whether you're too left or too right or too liberal or too progressive or it's being labeled, being accused now. It's almost hard to be a moderate. It's hard to talk about what's concerning. I don't know how to continue that, Jim. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to throw it to you. I
think our country is experiencing right now what I call a massive effort to divide us. Divide us by religion, divide us by race, divide us by economic strata, divide us by any other attitude. And one way that this is being expressed, and you put your finger right on all of the results and indicators or symptoms of it, and that is the breakdown of the rule of law. We have rules, we have laws against violence. The problem is they're not being enforced. And generally, historically, when somebody behaves badly, they get put in jail. And there's two reasons for that. One is punishment, and two is it keeps them out of polite society so they won't commit other offenses again, whether it's murder or rape or armed robbery or all the other social ills that come along with it. But in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a major effort to reduce, quote, mass incarceration and give people free bail, free bonds. So they may get, a perpetrator may get arrested, taken in, booked, but then immediately released. And one of the things that many big cities are finding out just within the last 2 or 3 years, exacerbated during the pandemic, is that a huge percentage of violent crimes are created by a relatively small number of people. And many of those people are repeat offenders that are out on bond. So my answer to the dilemma, the problem that you're stating is we are creating our own problem. We know what the answer is. Some people in charge are simply refusing to behave like the country has grown up on by enforcing the rule of law. And now, because of so much gun violence, Many people are proposing much more legislation. My observation is we don't need legislation. We've got plenty of legislation. We also have the Second Amendment. The problem isn't guns. The problem is people who use the guns. And there's a concentration of them geographically, and there's a concentration of the misbehavior demographically as well. You talk about the difficulty of speaking up for fear of being identified or having reprisals. I do think that is a consequence, but I personally refuse to be silenced by some indefinite mob. And I think what's happening is more and more and more people are beginning to get disgusted with some of these trends, and more people are objecting politically. The amazing thing that I have found astounding is that there is very little what we used to call vigilantism. In other words, when things get bad enough, some citizens take the law into their own hands and go enforce it. Thankfully, we have not seen much of that. There is a little bit of it, and those few cases get a lot of notoriety. But I think you go much further with some of this, and you will get that. You will.
So this is slippery slope. Vigilante justice never ends up well. In a democracy, in a law and order, a country that has law and order, it never ends up well.
Right.
It might be a short-term Band-Aid where it feels good because you're right. All my friends that are police officers, they tell me this for years now, how, for example, Harris County, city of Houston, so my question is Jim,
yeah,
why is it that we cannot, as Americans first, just by saying that people already say, oh, you labeled, you're conservative, you're right wing. Okay, let's being American first. Why can't we have both? Why does it have to be, it doesn't have to be separate. It could be parallel, or you could cross it. You could be, progressive on social issues, on racial inequality and justice. You could be conservative on, say, tax, or even maybe not, maybe be progressive on tax, either way. But on crime, on law and order, why does it need to be politics involved? It's very simple. You have to protect your citizens.
Well, I think the answer is very simple. I mean, it's absolutely foolishness to say things like, quote, defund the police. If anything, we need A, more law enforcement, and B, far more training of the law enforcement that we now have, which costs money. And we need, number 3, an integration of activity between community groups and law enforcement. The people who are getting hurt the most by this degradation in social behavior and increase in gun violence are the people who live in, unfortunately, bad neighborhoods. And they don't live there by choice. They live there because economically they have to, and they are easy prey.
Let's be honest on this. If me and you live in a neighborhood like that, and we have no means of getting out, we would have to play by the rules of the neighborhood, because you cannot depend on cops, especially in this day and age. With this, like you said, defund the police and whatnot. That's everyday life. So basically, gang life or criminal elements run the show because there's no consistent police presence. There's not enough funding, or there's not enough prosecution.
And there are problematic laws, but we'll come back to that. But if you want to see the pendulum, an example of the pendulum moving too far, supporting criminals at the expense of victims, watch the New York City mayor's race. Look what happened Tuesday of this week. The president of Brooklyn, which is population-wise the largest of New York City's 5 boroughs, is a former police officer.
That's right.
He's a very liberal man, even by New York standards, but he is, of the major candidates, there are 13 Democratic candidates, but of the major 4, he is by far the most strident law and order candidate. He has the respect and the backing of the NYPD. And no surprise, he did by far the best in the first person balloting.
Is Eric, I remember his first name is Eric something.
Eric Adams.
Eric Adams, that's right. And that's good. Why you can't have both, right? Now, Jim, I want to talk about defunding the police a little bit. I think we touched it before. Look, in this heat in this summer, right? We read front page news. We hear different police chiefs or community activists talk about why there's a crime wave. We know there's a massive crime wave in New York on all 5 boroughs. They say it's heat. The pandemic has caused the wealth divide to be widened. People have been cooped up, so they commit more crime, to whatever. But the fact is, we know that the protests of last year and without being labeled, the fact that BLM and defund the police has affected the morale and the motivation of police officers. That's logical and reasonable. That makes sense. But when we talk about defund the police, we also don't want to be manipulated by saying defunding the police means disbanding police officers, have community supervision. We know there is no way that would ever work. Any logical, reasonable person, what they really mean, it's easy to see, well, defund the police. What the main point of defund the police, defund those funds that goes to buy SWAT equipment, military-grade tanks and weapons, as if we're battling our citizens. In the 80s, we did that because of the war on drugs. That's why it goes back to Reagan. It's actually a failure if you look back. The war on drugs actually created a lot of these issues. Instead of, if we look at the more progressive, advanced European nations, the way they treat the drug pandemic, to put them in rehab, to legalize some of them even, to regulate it. We could go back, we could argue about this for a long time, but the facts and the stats doesn't change. So this war on drugs created this militarized police, which also is a no-no. Now, does it make sense in certain places? Of course. You're combating these drug organizations that have these profits that local police cannot compete with. In the 80s and 90s, it was. Do you remember a movie called RoboCop, Jim?
I remember it. I never saw it.
Yeah, growing up, it was, so it shows that the police there's no way they compete with crime syndicates. So you go back to defund the police. It means defunding those funds and then using those funds to retrain, to give them more training even, how to deal with it, and to put in psychology experts or social workers and vet them, because to diffuse it. But of course, there's never going to be 0 cases. There will always be the shootouts or dealing with this mass shootings, and then because of the fact that this country allows assault weapons. I don't know. I look at some of these countries that did ban. Look at Australia. Look at Norway. Look at Northern Europe. They have other sets of problems, but mass shooting is not one of them. Criminals with heavy duty weaponry is not one of them. Jim, it's disheartening because it's, like I said, summer, for me, growing up, summer is a great time to recharge, to enjoy our time. I was telling you how busy summer is for my kids. But instead of, enjoying our freedom after the pandemic and to travel, to relax, we have to worry about getting shot while driving in the street, being robbed. You can't even avoid it. What can I do when someone has an AK-47? There's nothing. I'm not carrying one with me when I'm with my kids or when I'm working. What can I do? There's really not much. It's really, you're at the mercy of fate. You're at the mercy of the Lord that we trusted.
Well, one of the things that is happening now, nobody wants to talk about it, but it's absolutely true. Big cities are losing population. I saw a housing study done by the Kinder Institute about Houston. Look, when the census comes out, the 2020 census, there are going to be a lot of people that are going to be shocked. I've been saying this for 30 years. The city of Houston is losing population. The city of Chicago is losing population. The city of Los Angeles is losing population. Why? For a whole host of reasons, but right at the top of the list is exactly what you're talking about. The balance between paying for a lifestyle and getting services, beginning with keeping the population safe, that balance has gone awry. And
Hit
guess
the death
what?
cross.
People are voting with their feet. And it's not just what we used to call white flight. Look, I lived in Washington, D.C. twice in my life. In 1976 through 1981. When I lived there the first time, Washington, D.C. was 85% Black. When I went back 15 years later from 2002 to 2004, Washington was 65% Black. And you may say, oh, yeah, that was partly because of white gentrification, diluting the existing Black population. That is partially true, but it is a small percentage of the delta. What is the major reason why the Black population percentage went down? Because middle class Black people, which is the long-term base of the Washington, D.C. population, they left. They left because the schools were bad, because public safety was bad, because healthcare was bad, because transportation was bad. And the biggest beneficiary was a suburban county in the Northeast called Prince George's County. And you can look at that. Exactly the same thing has happened to Oakland and San Francisco and Los Angeles. You just look all around, and guess what? It has happened to Houston now. Houston has lost population significantly in the last 2 years. All the while, the leadership of the city of Houston, the leadership of Harris County is now at best flat. They are all basking in the growth glow of Texas. Oh, Texas is growing. And by implication, Houston is growing too. And guess who is leaving? It's the middle class. And now they have been using the pandemic as the rationale. Okay, some of that's true. People want to work at home and they'd like to live in the suburbs. Okay, that's all true. But the reason they want to live in the suburbs is safer. It's less expensive. You have an easier lifestyle. The schools are better. It's more dependable. Yeah. So people are voting with their feet in many, many ways. And I really think it's a tragedy. I've spent my career developing real estate and studying urban affairs, whether it's fiscal conditions, social delivery of services, managing. And cities are where things happen. Historically, where value is added in the economy, where opportunities are. Historically, with all the immigrant experience that the United States had, people come and live in cities because that's where you can accelerate quickest. You can get on at the lowest level of the ladder and move quicker. But now, more and more immigrant populations and minorities no longer want to live in the cities because it doesn't do it anymore. And so the cities are hollowing out. We are now beginning to see in Houston, and I believe it's the case in several other cities, that we have empty office buildings that were built in the 60s, 1960s, 1970s. They're 50 years old, and they're empty. They're sitting there on the freeway interchanges with very nice frontage, but they're empty because not only are people leaving, but jobs are leaving. There was an article in the New York Times this morning about how Philip Morris, who historically has made Marlboro cigarettes, they're now moving away from tobacco-based products. They moved 200 employees out of Manhattan into Connecticut. And they said the whole reason it's a great place to raise a family. Suburban Connecticut. And this has been going on for a very long time. So anyway, I don't mean to dominate the conversation, but it's you put your finger on a very important social.
No, I wanted to hear this because you have the experience and the contrast of living in look, guys, I don't mean to, I know growing up hearing the stories of Washington, D.C. I mean, there are horrendous stories coming out of the crime that perpetrated there in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
And then we also see Baltimore, Prince George County. I'm familiar with this because I visited Baltimore, D.C. area 2 years ago for the first time in 20 years. When I was in college, I went with my family. Everyone goes to D.C. to see everything. But being a tourist in D.C. and going out to Baltimore, to Maryland, it's very different.
Most of Baltimore now. Baltimore historically has been a very blue collar union-based manufacturing city, but starting about 30 years ago, it got into a tailspin. In the last 10 years, 15 years have been very unkind to Baltimore. Baltimore is a shell of its former self. It's a damn shame. I mean, the areas around Baltimore, the suburban communities, are doing just fine.
I don't know about that because the people that are in Baltimore that I speak with, like you said, they complain that gentrification, that the community is being robbed of the growth in real estate or harbor site. The Baltimore Harbor is beautiful.
Yeah.
And the townhomes there, that used to be majority African-American owned are now increasing the value. I mean, it's like you want the cake and you want it, you want the cherry on top and you want it both. You want the development to come in. Yes, Baltimore is very corrupt, by the way. This is not accusations. Okay, we know there's a lot of, you're not one of them, or else you wouldn't be in Houston. But the fact is, there's some greasing that you have to do in order to spread the wealth out. Okay, look, I know what I'm saying is going to take a beating, but there's no way you can undo 30, 40, 50 years of decay, urban decay.
And you don't turn it around overnight.
No, and you need private money. You need monetary incentives. And it takes time and it takes a coordinated effort. So what I'm saying is, look, in DC and Baltimore, when it was bad, everyone complained. Now it's gentrified, everyone's still complaining. And when everyone moves to suburbs, we know in Texas, the voting patterns, metropolitan areas are blue, suburbs are going to be red. And the divide gets wider and wider. In the city of Houston, where we're from, we know that the Memorial Villages have their own police. We know in Rice Village have their own police. We know in River Oaks they have their own police. Why is that? I mean, Houston doesn't have zoning. So you can have businesses next to a school next to a residential area. It's a curse and it's also a blessing. I guess
zoning doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about now.
No, it doesn't. You're right. What I meant, I guess it's property value. But the fact is that, you literally could be in a $1 million mansion, multi-million-dollar mansion, cross the street, and be in a lot that's worth nothing. I mean, that's rare, but that's in Houston. Yes, it's quite often.
No, people have been saying that for a long time. They say that, but when they say that, they're insulting the people who live there. That make you think that the people who participate in our market, the people who buy and sell things, don't have any sense. Nobody is going to make stupid land use decisions when they own the land. Usually the people who take best care of land are the people who own it. Okay. So if somebody's going to invest in something, generally they're going to do the smart thing. Not always, but overwhelmingly so. And I can tell you from watching over the years, they make much better decisions than bureaucrats that are hired to create zoning. So anyway, but I don't think zoning has anything to do with our crime issues.
You're right, it does not. But this heat wave, this crime, this 2021, what do we call it? A hot summer. I don't know what do you call it. It's just scary. Every day you see it. It's funny. We look at media. Sensationalism of press coverage. People actually do see it. You attract more and more viewers, which I understand. I don't know what's going to happen in Houston. I moved away I enjoy living in the city. I always have. Because I grew up in the suburbs. But now that I have children, I think for my kids, I did make the right choice. The fact that we have more of a community, more, like you said, maybe not even the convenience. To me, it's inconvenient to live in the suburbs because everything that happens inside the loop. We've been saying that for 50 years, but it really still is, right? But to live inside the loop, you have to have immense wealth and mobility because actually you have no mobility because traffic is so bad in all the metropolitan areas. Unless you have a chauffeur, it's really hard to get by. So you have to plan everything ahead of time. So living in the suburbs still means that I'm stuck here because it takes 40 minutes to go into downtown. Just to go to dinner with friends, literally I have to plan it out down to, should we valet? Should we Uber? It's craziness.
I know. It shouldn't be this difficult, but anyway.
But this TxDOT doing this quickly to bring this in is the traffic that how do I say this, that fuels road rage. For them to shut down 59 and 610, which is an exit I take probably every day for the past 15 years, it's pretty ridiculous because to do this now, why didn't they think of doing this during the pandemic, which I just don't understand when there's less traffic? They had a year and a half. They shut this down for a year, and it is Armageddon out there, Jim. It takes me double the time, an hour and a half round trip just to get to the Galleria area. It's bad.
Well, no, I understand, but I think TxDOT was working on major projects all the way through the pandemic. They probably made a lot more progress because they could do it more quickly because the traffic was lighter. But we all demand better traffic services. So it just has to happen. The big issue that TxDOT's fighting now is community pushback from the expansion of Interstate 45 downtown, saying that it's dividing communities of color. People complained about that in the 50s and 60s in New York. That was the big social reaction to a man named Robert Moses. None of this is new. We are going around and around and around and around.
Well, how did it end up in New York back in the 50s, 60s? How did it end up in New York in the 50s and 60s?
Who?
In New York, the complaint. How did it benefit the community? Did it improve mobility?
Oh, yeah. There was a man that was in charge of public works in New York. His name was Robert Moses. And many of the like the Cross Bronx Expressway, things like that, they were built under Robert Moses's sponsorship. And a lot of communities complained that he was breaking them apart by running a freeway through them. And there was a woman, very famous not really an urban planner, more what we would call today a community activist named Jane Jacobs, who became extremely famous by opposing Mr. Moses and creating citizen backlash and preserving what was, in her mind, and many, many other people's minds, the best of New York. And after a while, she created enough political strength to really overcome and disgrace Mr. Moses. But he was what was called the power broker during the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. It was New York City went through major changes during that period of time. It's a very interesting exercise in history, but I don't want to divert our conversation or distract our main audience here. But
no, you're not. It all ties in.
But I'm sure if people were allowed to speak freely in China, many people who have lost their homes, their neighborhoods to major public works projects, be they freeways or dams or even airports or other things, I'm sure they would say the same things as well.
My friend, I thank the Lord you bring this up, because there's not one person in Houston more familiar with this subject than myself. I tell you what, not only do we discuss this, I follow up on the news because when I was in college, distant relative of mine that did not leave China, my aunt had requested help for someone that lived overseas. I have no idea what's going on. And I learned this. I learned it. Nothing much I could do. Same thing. The government wanted to take her residence. In China, your residence is given by the unit you work for, because before the 80s, before they opened up, whatever unit. Let's say you're a teacher, then your school will assign you a unit. If you are a construction worker, then the government department will assign you a unit, and that's the only thing you have. And it's your home, right? No matter what race, what country, you're going to guard, your eminent domain. You're going to guard your home. While during development, they did this. We see whatever is leaked, we see some of it. But I'm going to tell you the difference between China now and then. We have to say this: Republican Party, Democrat Party is not the same 30 years ago or 40 years ago. Our country is not the same. Our government, the way we think. The Communist Party is not the same. They're trying to govern. They're trying to learn. They also want their people to not overthrow them. And the people of China definitely is not the same. The fact that they can use internet freely, they can travel anywhere freely, they can immigrate freely, has changed the game. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what's going on with these taking. So when happened to my relatives, I was young, I couldn't help much. I knew that they wanted to take her land, so they had local thugs, criminal elements. They're not police. They may be, but they're not in uniform. Come out and then turn the lights off, turn the power off, pour blood on the door, intimidate her. She's an old lady. She's a teacher, retired middle school teacher. Basically, they're giving her a very small amount of compensation for her to move out. Now, I'm going to tell you this, okay? I know it's very hard to say because this is not the case for everyone. A lot of the folks that refuse to move, some of the folks that refuse to move probably were forced out. We will never know what really happened, right? Because they're the ones without the voice. I'm talking about 20 years ago. A lot of them that moved financially benefited from it. Because during the economic boom of the last 25 years, no matter what city you're in China, if you move to a new building, your money went up. So you're living in this dingy old apartment built in the 50s or 60s that's worth 100,000, 50,000. They move you to a new unit, high rise, they give you one unit to replay you. That unit, no matter where you are, is going to go up in value. Does that make sense? So your 100,000 probably became $500,000 or $1 million. That's why everyone just shut up, but people, the ones that make money, they're not going to brag about it. But what you say still happens in China now. For example, if this happens now, they have no way of, there's no guns in China, strict gun control. So there's no real gun violence. So you know what they do? Because a lot of construction, a lot of mining is easily explosives are easily accessible. So the biggest crimes in the last 10, 15 years, they will make homemade bombs, either mail it to the party official or they'll bring it and blow themselves up along with the people they're taking their land. And this happens very often. I don't want to laugh about it. It's very sad. Or the very unique Chinese way of expressing your displeasure at the local government is called shangfeng. It comes down from when there was dynasties, emperors. Shangfeng is when the emperor comes out of the palace to inspect. These regular citizens run in front and kneel down and kowtow to the emperor to tell them of unjust. Because if you're in China, it's a huge country. The way the system works is, it doesn't go up. Bad news doesn't go up; it only goes down. So they'll never know. So they shangfeng. Well, in the city of Beijing, there's literally a department that deals with people that shangfeng. Either you block them out, you arrest them. You can't charge them. You can't really, press charges. So you really have no choice. There's no resolve unless you blow yourself up.
The other big difference between China and the United States, in the United States, we have the 14th Amendment that says the government cannot take anything from you without just compensation.
I think that is that's what's beautiful about our Constitution and about our Bill of Rights. Our forefathers had the foresight to know that this is how you hold government accountable and respectable. Right. Jim, thank you for this insightful conversation. You made my day because, I was my kids, summer is very hard for people here.
Yeah.
You know, we talked about it with the high cost of living. We can't hire full-time maids, nannies, whatever it is. And being parents, you went through this. You raised.
Yeah. Next week, let's talk about what you do with your children during the summer.
I want to know what you do with your children, so I can learn. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jimmy. Bye-bye.
Take care, guys. See you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.